Hello, and welcome to the Further podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars, to skydiving, to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit, and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out-there experiences on people's minds and brains. All right, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Very controversial topic, or at least, it feels like that in the wake of the FDA hearing where MDMA was not approved. Since then, and during that hearing, there were a lot of very critical voices sharing their views of MAPS and Lycos, and those critical voices at times were quite divisive among people in the community, and a lot of people were understandably upset about the results of the FDA hearing. This makes sense, a potential treatment that could help many people whose lives have been torn apart by PTSD. That is worthy of getting upset. But I think one thing that has happened is people have kind of forgotten thinking about what is it like to be a participant in one of these trials. What was it like for somebody to receive MDMA for PTSD in a MAPS study? So I happened to see that Becca Kacanda was quite vocal on Twitter about her experience in the trial. And so, I decided that, it would be worthwhile to hear somebody's own story about what it was like to be in the study. So this interview focuses on her experience, both the good and the bad. It wasn't all fun, let's just say that, but it definitely wasn't terrible either. And she provides a very nuanced perspective on how, this sort of media and hype surrounding psychedelics more broadly interfaced with her experience in the trial. She also shares a bit about how she felt hearing some of the critiques that have been levied against MAPS and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and she provides a pretty nuanced perspective, which I really appreciated. And another thing I enjoyed about our conversation is we really tried to focus on, what could the field do moving forward? How could a future MDMA therapist better work with a participant? What does she wish that hypothetical therapist would know now? And how could, people in the media, scientists who discuss this drug, what could they do differently going forward? So I really appreciate that constructive criticism, and I found it quite refreshing, and just seeing that nuance is still possible. Love that. Yeah, and I also really appreciated Becca's bravery for sharing her story. So, deep appreciation of that. Her willingness to share her story also is helping me be bold enough, I suppose, to actually share this podcast. I went back and forth quite a number of times about whether this was risky to do in some way. But ultimately, I think it's important to remember that with these trials and these critiques, that people, I guess, ultimately are at the center of it, and seeing what is it like, what are their experiences like, is quite important. So on that valuable, Becca also has a unique perspective as she is training to be a clinician right now. So I also appreciate that. And yeah, I guess I will just let her tell her story. So with that, we will get into the podcast. All right. So I am here with Becca Kacanda, and it was a participant in the MDMA assisted therapy trial for PTSD. This has been a much discussed topic recently. There's a lot of different narratives being thrown around, and I thought it would be interesting to interview a person who, did participate in a trial to figure out more what that was like and just, yeah, to hear your thoughts about it. So, yeah, here is Becca.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Haley. I have been sort of behind the scenes watching and listening to a lot of conversation going on about the trial, and I felt like there was not enough perspective from the patient participant side. So thank you for allowing me to share from that side, and I think we'll have a really constructive conversation. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I guess we should just start out with you telling us a bit about your experience. Because people seem to have some misconceptions about what the trial was like, whether or not it was cult-like or new age or lots of different things being said.
Sure. Yes, there's definitely a lot of strong opinions. So just for context, I phased out of the trial 2 years ago, so it's been a little bit, but not too long. I was part of the phase 3 trial, um, and I had an amazing experience in the trial. Um, it was there's so much to say about it. It's almost hard to know where to focus because there's the aspects of applying for the trial and waiting to find out, and it's very nerve wracking. And I think like most applicants, I was pretty desperate to find something that was helpful. Um, so it was a long waiting process, but the trial itself, the dosing sessions, my experiences with the therapy, there's therapy that prepares you for the dosing sessions. There's therapy in between dosing sessions. I think a lot of people don't realize that. There's a lot more than just the MDMA sessions, and I really had a good relationship and a good resonance with my trial therapists, and found the dosing sessions to be very helpful, very cathartic. I made a lot of sort of breakthroughs that I wasn't able to make with regular therapy that I had tried prior to that: talk therapy, CBT, um, EMDR. So overall, my experience was very positive. I don't want to oversimplify it, though. It's not always easy, and it was not like an overnight instantaneous fix. I think some of the media narratives might be presenting it in that way, and it might be that way for some people. But my experience was not quite that instantaneous. But I still felt that I was making a lot of progress throughout the time, even though there were some ups and downs. Um, and the dosing sessions themselves were wonderful. As far as therapy, as far as trauma therapy can be wonderful or pleasant, it was amazing. So yeah, I mean, I can go more into that in a bit, but I guess I wanted to say overall, I had a very positive experience. Um, you mentioned the cult thing. I think we have to touch on that. It So I think we spoke about this briefly before, and I think it's important to mention. I have I found the cult criticism to be particularly offensive, and it's actually a big part of the reason why I decided to sort of go public to an extent, as I have, um, because that was absolutely not. the way my experience unfolded. I have religious trauma in my background where my experiences in a certain sect of Christianity was very coercive, very fear based. So I am maybe more familiar with what that could be like. And that did not play a role in my experience in the trial or the way my therapist presented the modalities to me. It never once crossed my mind that I was being like brainwashed or, um, uh, you know, conditioned to like accept an ideology that was totalizing or anything like that. I found it to be actually really the opposite, where I felt that the modality was very liberating because it allowed me a lot of space to explore how I personally felt about what had happened to me and what I needed to heal. So I think that's the opposite of what I think a cult would be like, or a religious ideology where you're being coerced to accept a certain set of beliefs. Yeah, it's just that just wasn't it wasn't my experience, thankfully. I think it's possible that there are people within the field who are more perhaps overzealous or you know unwilling to look at more negative aspects or harms that could occur. But yeah, I that it just wasn't presented to me in a way that I would say is at all similar to what a cult is like. So yeah. um yeah, I guess we could unpack that more.
So it sounds to me like, there's definitely a very strong narrative about MDMA assisted therapy just being something where you go through it and you're transformed. Dealing with PTSD is no longer an issue, and that doesn't sound like your experience. But on the other hand, the very sort of negative view of this therapy did not sound like your experience either.
No. And yeah, I think you're presenting like a sort of polarity maybe that we've been presented with, which is like this hype where it's so simple and you have a dosing session and you don't have PTSD anymore and it's amazing and life is perfect. Um, that's that's not true for me. So, and I think it's probably not true for the majority of people. I think more people most likely had more complex experiences. So, we have the media oversimplification hype on one end, and then we have like this cult narrative on the other end that says that, MAPS is like espousing some secret, sinister ideology under the surface, and is, coercing patients to go through some kind of a trauma exorcism that's really uncomfortable and dangerous and involves questionably ethical and potentially abusive practices. And I think those things have happened, and we know of one famous, or I don't know, infamous case of that occurring. And I think it's really tragic, and I think it's important to know about that. But fortunately, I think that case is a bit of an outlier. And I can't really speak as an authority on it because I don't know everybody's situation and nobody really knows everybody's situation. But I know that my experience was extremely different from that one. So there's more nuance in between, and I know that there are some participants who maybe weren't on either end of the spectrum either, but fell somewhere in the middle that was maybe a little bit more on the negative side. I would say mine is more on the positive side, but I think the criticisms that people are bringing up are all very important.
Mm-hmm.
I hopefully I'm not getting too in the weeds here, but I guess that the polarity that you brought up, I think, is definitely evident. We have like the hype and then the anti-hype, and neither of them are completely true.
Yeah, I guess going back to your experience itself during the trial, it sounds like there were a lot of ups and downs. There were moments that were difficult. And yeah, I guess maybe you could tell us a bit more about that, because I think there is an idea that, if somebody's having a difficult time in therapy, that's problematic. There's been that
Sure.
sort of discussed as a point, even though treating trauma is difficult in general. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really important discussion, and I there's a lot of nuance here, and a lot of the criticism around it I kind of want to like tease apart a little bit. Um, I I think when we're working with trauma, especially PTSD, which is like a prolonged state of unresolved trauma, very often dealing with extremely distressing subject, or always dealing with extremely distressing subject matter. A lot of participants have dealt with sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I know we hear a lot about the veteran narrative, but dealing with, I'll speak from the perspective of a person who went into the trial to work with sexual abuse and sexual assault related subject matter. It's really, really difficult subject matter, and it's really complicated because you have not only the, abuse that took place, but all of the things that surround the abuse that took place that were additionally damaging, like people not believing you, the shame that you've, held on to from that, the sort of the damage that has done, the way it's robbed you of living your life to the fullest. Like there's just so much, the secrecy behind it and all of that. So there's a lot to unpack with it. And I think it's unrealistic to think that you will not be dealing with a lot of heavy emotions and grief to process in between. I think some of the criticisms that I've seen, like within the trial, therapists are required to report adverse events. And I'm not an expert on how all of that works, but I'll do my best. I've seen cases written about where, clients will be at work crying in between sessions and need to talk to their therapist. Just other, and yeah, and even more extreme versions of that, like suicidal ideation, which did not occur in my case, but I definitely really struggled with feelings of grief in between. And the way I understood that was my mood or my disposition going into the trial was like included a lot of shame, panic, like hiding of how I was feeling so I could get through and get through the world. And as you start to break these things down and you use MDMA to explore these feelings, you kind of break through some of those like frozen, panicked, shameful protectors or barriers, and you uncover other aspects of how you dealt with the situation or what you felt about it. And it can be really difficult. Like in my case, I started to feel more as my perspective on what happened changed, I started to feel some grief about what happened to me. I started to feel empathy about what happened to me, and or sympathy towards myself, I should say. And it was really sad. But it was movement from where I was previously. So it's not like an instant shift from like where you are to being fully older, fully past the trauma. It's a journey through it. And I think the journey with MDMA assisted psychotherapy is maybe more compact and intense than it would be otherwise. So within that phase of being in the trial, there's a lot going on. And you do need a lot of support, or I needed a lot of support. And there is support built into the trial. And I want to mention this too, because I think a lot of people don't know about this aspect, but within the MAPS MDMA assisted therapy protocol, in between dosing sessions, you speak to your therapist every other day for 2 weeks after each dosing session. And that's in addition to the preparatory sessions and the hour and a half integration sessions the morning after. So there is a lot of built in additional support that I think a lot of people following along with aren't even aware of. And follow up support. I think there's probably more of a need for follow up support than is able to be built into the trial itself. But yeah, I guess that's, I guess that is what I would like to get across, is that there's there's there are difficult feelings to process as your perspective on what happened is changing. I also wanted to um, share this as well. I think this is a part of the trial experience that maybe people don't think about, but within the MDMA dosing session, I think it's possible and common. And for me, I experienced what I would say are like breakthroughs in my perspective about what happened to me that I was not able to achieve with regular therapy. And, there were concepts that I couldn't fully absorb in regular therapy. I could be told things like, it wasn't your fault, you're not a bad person, etc. But I never fully felt that. It was never something that like I could embody. I never felt it as truth like deep within me, and but I was able to get there during the dosing sessions. And I think coming out of that, I felt some like God, like some grief, like why couldn't I get there before? And why is this therapy not available? And why is this drug illegal? And what, like this works. I've made so much progress. I've been able to achieve things that I just could never do before. And if I had access to this before, the last 5, 6, 7, for some people, decades of life could have been so much better. So I think that's a sort of a interesting side effect. Like if you're able to make so much progress because you happen to luck out by getting to do this therapy, you know, it might you might feel a little bit cheated that you weren't able to get it before. I don't, does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely, like when you've been dealing with something for so long and it just sounds like it's become like ingrained almost in who you are as a person,
Yeah.
it not being there, that I can understand how that could create a sense of grief. But it sounds like when you were in the therapy, like you were able to get like insights that your previous experiences with therapy were trying to get you to sort of make to like accept that it wasn't your fault and whatnot. But yeah, that's interesting. Do you feel like the therapist you were working with were encouraging you to have any sort of specific insights or conclusions, even if they were as simple as, oh, it's not my fault?
Great question. No, I don't. And I, there was, I'll go into this in a little bit. There was like a little bit of direction in my third session. But for the majority, for the first two sessions, there was no direction by the therapist as to what I should be achieving or exploring while under the influence of MDMA. I was asked to set intentions for what I wanted to explore within the session. So I was able to think about that a little bit before, getting there that morning. I was able to tell them what my intention was, and then I, took the drug and let it do its thing. And in my opinion, it's pretty hard to control what comes up when you're on MDMA. You're guided in the MAPS protocol to, you have the eye shades on and music, and you're guided to just like lay back, listen to the music, and see what comes up. And then share that with your therapist when you feel like you have something to share. And then their role is to provide support and validation regarding what's coming up for you. And I think this non-directive approach is, I think it makes a lot of sense for MDMA because you just don't know how it's going to work within your body. And even from session to session, the first dosing session is a lower dose than the second and third. But so the second and third were the same dose, and I took the booster each time. But my experience for the second and third session was so different. My second session had a lot of somatic things, just like a lot of tension being like released from my body in really interesting ways. And, my third session didn't really have that. So I think, because this is where we're, talking about the directive and non-directive approach is sort of in relation to this concept of the inner healing intelligence. And I guess we could get into that because that's been another highly contested topic. But I think the philosophy that I took from it was that the inner healer and the non-directive approach is that the client patient is given permission to explore whatever it is that is coming up for them and feels valid and relevant to them, and that they are not being forced or coerced to dwell upon an aspect of their trauma that an outside person or the therapist thinks is the most important. So, and I think that's key. And I don't think it would have been as successful for me if I had my therapist or anybody on the outside like pushing me to explore something that they thought was important. Or even to just dive right into the, assault, let's say, or the whatever it is, that I could explore things that were coming up that were important to me at the time. So like my like journey, through the sessions, I took an arc that not even I could have predicted, but looking back on it, it makes a lot of sense. Like I was able to sort of build up my I don't know how much we want to go into it, but I want to try to give examples without, giving too much detail. But I guess what I can say is like in my case, it felt important to me to like build up my confidence and my belief in myself before I was able to explore the most difficult aspects of what happened to me. And and if you read other like case studies, you'll see some examples of that. That I think it's a way to allow clients to feel safe as they start to explore these things without being pushed into it too early. And I think the the fact that like some of these cognitive distortions that I had developed in the course of like having PTSD were was sort of like organically unraveled by me without anyone telling me like I've noticed you've had this cognitive distortion and I would like you to believe this. Like the fact that it was me that recognized that it was a problem and that I was able to reconstruct them all on my own, I think is part of the reason why it has stuck with me. It's because
Mm.
I did it and not because someone was telling me to do it. So I think that's the beauty of the non-directive approach is that the client, and this is what I learned in school too. I'm going to school for counseling and art therapy now, is like the client is the expert in their own experience and they're the expert in what they need. So that's not like an ideology that's like bizarre and unique to MAPS MDMA assisted therapy. It's broader than that. And I think that it I think that it has contributed to my long lasting like positive effects of this is because
Mm.
it improved, I guess you could to use like therapy jargon, it like improved my sense of self efficacy because I did it. So
Mm.
so it helped to build up that trust within myself.
It really, to me, sounds like the inner healer. Some people might say that's kind of like a woo-woo concept, but when you describe it, it just sounds to me like a very patient-centered, like, therapy approach. Like, it doesn't sound really all that different from other forms of therapy. And it does sound quite positive, but you also mentioned that there was one instance where it was a bit more directive. Maybe you could discuss that a little more.
Sure. So okay. I um so in the MAPS protocol in the trial, you have 3 dosing sessions that are spread a month apart. Um, I spoke during my dosing sessions. I did address the trauma, but only sort of indirectly, maybe. So I was really addressing like the fallout of the trauma and how it affected me, and not so much getting to not so much like addressing exactly what happened within the sexual abuse and assault and that relationship. And my it was suggested to me before, in between the second and third session, that like maybe you're ready to explore that, or maybe you would like to. It was not like it wasn't presented to me like you have to, but it was brought to my attention that I had been sort of addressing like issues surrounding it, but not so much that abuse, that relationship of abuse. So that was the one sort of, I would say that was the one piece of guidance that I got going into it. Um, it didn't happen. I also want to say it wasn't brought up during the dosing session. I think that, it was brought up in a way so that I could prepare. and start to think about like what would it mean for me to explore that, and how do I am I ready? How do I feel about that? Um, and it kind of it ended up like unfolding for me within the session, and I think I had some of the most impactful and meaningful insights during that session. Um, perhaps in a more ideal setting, there could have been more space in between the second and third dosing session. I think like these are some, critiques that I think are valid, because a 3-month period is a really short period of time to be processing all of it. But yeah, it's like, within the context of the trial, we just wanted to make sure that I was not missing an opportunity to explore like the most difficult parts of my trauma while I had the support of MDMA and therapists to help me. So, um, yeah, I hope that makes sense. I think it's, I think within the non-directive approach, so to speak, there's like a little bit of direction. Um, but it is for the most part like uh pretty loose in yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think what you've shared with us today just about, how much of a process it was, and how, there were moments that were difficult and it really was patient centered. That all that hasn't been discussed too much, I would say, in just the media coverage of this trial. So it's nice to get an inside perspective. Going back to when you were trying to get in the trial, anticipating being involved, all of that, it sounds like you really were, I don't want to say excited, but very hopeful about the potential that MDMA assisted psychotherapy could have for you. Maybe you could share some of your like expectations going into the trial, or how aware you were of just media surrounding psychedelics at the time.
Yes, that is a great question. I guess I'll share how I found out about it. Well, I found out about it in a very roundabout way. Just having it, like I had a friend who experienced like an underground um, psychedelic ceremony with psilocybin, and it wasn't for mental health reasons specifically. Like there wasn't a licensed clinician on hand, but things that came up, she had a lot of things come up for her that were related to trauma, and found it to be really helpful. So she shared this with me, and I became interested in the idea of psychedelics being helpful for my trauma. I just happened to Google PTSD clinical trials because she gave me the idea. She was just like, maybe you can just Google PTSD clinical trials and see if an interesting treatment opportunity comes up, because I hadn't really had luck with the other things I was trying. And so this came up. I had been interested and curious about psychedelics for a very long time, not in a very serious academic way and not really in a mental health way, just interested in them maybe more from like the artistic perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of history with psychedelics and art and culture. So, and I had used before, and had powerful experiences, both positive and negative. So I guess in my head, I thought that psychedelics were powerful. And, my friend had had this healing experience on them. So with them, so it became a very interesting possibility for me. And I thought, what do I have to lose? I really didn't think I'd be contacted. Like I filled out the application and I was like, I'll probably won't hear back. Um, but then I did. And so that, of course, that like hopefulness comes into play because then it's like, well, it might happen. But it's a really long screening process. So it's a really long waiting period of like, oh God, I hope this could happen. But, there's still so many barriers to being accepted into the trial. But at that point, I started to like, I don't even think I was actively searching for media around it. I think that the algorithm just sent it my way because I'm pretty active on social media. So then I felt like all of a sudden, like, just there were so many targeted ads coming my way on Facebook and Instagram about the trial and about psychedelics for mental health. And I was following MAPS too. So I did start to explore um, media coverage on it. And of course, at that time, this is like pre FDA hearing, pre symposia critiques. So it was very glowing media coverage. So I became very excited. Um, yeah, I guess. I mean, there's a lot more to say about the media hype. Is a little bit distracting, I would say, as I was part of the trial. But yeah, I was certainly aware of it and became more aware of it as I was going through the trial. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't even think about the targeted ad
Yeah.
aspect of this, and it's so interesting because like I will get targeted ads too. And it's
Really?
bizarre things like psychedelic water, quote unquote.
Oh
And it's not
yeah,
even
I know.
it's not even water or it doesn't have psychedelics in it. And it's
No,
like
it's just water.
at what point does all of this become like just like a marketing thing? Like, ooh, this is trendy. Let's write more articles about it and people will click it and ooh, like
oh yeah.
it's yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that you had a friend that sort of got you interested in it. And I guess that sort of component of being exposed to, I don't want to say psychedelic hype, but positive psychedelic experiences. Um, I guess that might be happening more now as more people are using in general in the population. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's quite interesting. So what you mentioned that it was kind of annoying at points and distracting. What do you mean by that?
Okay, if I recall what I brought up with my therapist, one, I remember being um, a little bit annoyed with how the focus on MDMA for PTSD was so focused around veterans. Because I know, at least for my trial site, I guess I can't say this officially, but what I had heard was that the majority, if not all of the participants, were sexual assault or abuse survivors. So we know that PTSD, as a consequence of sexual assault and abuse is like huge. I think statistics show it's what, half or more of adults with PTSD or people with PTSD is a result of sexual abuse and assault. So it was like pretty clear to me that there was a like PR strategy in the focus on veterans. Not that veterans aren't absolutely deserving of treatments. They are, but I guess I was just like unpacking with my therapist the strategy that MAPS was using to get support and obviously funding to conduct these trials, and that there is a PR strategy to it that is political, and that is the way it is. And of course that media, journalists, they headlines, like they're all gonna play into buzzy headlines and like fantastical stories, and all of that. And, you know, reading an article in the New York Times or Times Magazine or whatever is not a replacement for like actually understanding a form of therapy. I think we need to be more critical of what of how we are understanding what's going on and understand the motives of people who are sharing stories and what their what their motives are, what their spin is on it, what they might be leaving out, what they're trying to achieve, all of that. So I was able, yeah, I was able to bring these questions up with my therapist, and they were able to provide very nuanced and I think truthful responses about it. So I found that to be helpful. It was helpful to have them be critical of it, and sort of, you know, get the bigger picture of what's at play. It's a pretty complicated landscape, to have to raise funds, for mental health treatment on a, all right, this is like not my area of expertise, but it's a pretty weird landscape that we're in. You know, our healthcare landscape is pretty bizarre. So, and MAPS is a part of that. MAPS exists within a cultural context that, is highly imperfect, and healthcare is one of the most fucked up. Our healthcare system is really fucked up. So we're trying to figure out how to introduce new treatments into this really fucked up system, and it's very messy. Yes.
Yeah.
Could be a whole other podcast about that. And again, it's not my area of expertise. I just yeah, there's a lot to talk about with it, but yeah.
So I guess kind of imagining, you know, what the optimal way like this therapy could be talked about, how it could be rolled out, just things you wish that, you know, maybe were talked about more. I guess maybe you could share, like, what do you think was being voiced more, considering MDMA assisted psychotherapy from your perspective as a patient?
What do I wish was being voiced more now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, okay. I think that what is missing, and from my perspective, what I think something important that's missing is like what is actually helpful or not helpful about this therapy for people. Like what is actually healing about it? I've heard like podcasts describe it as like a black box, like they don't really know what's happening. They just hear like maybe statistical outcomes, but not personal stories or not more nuanced stories. So I think outsiders really know very little about all the idiosyncratic experiences that people have that lead to healing. I'm also interested in like learning more about how patients utilized or understood the concept of the inner healing intelligence, like what role did that play in their experience or their healing, or was it not helpful? Also interested to hear about what role they felt that the therapist placed or played in their healing, and other just more feedback on other specific context within the trial, like touch. You know, this is also really controversial. Like, how many participants opted to use touch within the trial? And how did they use it? How important was it? Was it harmful? Was it neutral? Like, could it took it or leave it type of thing? So I think these are the specific discussions that can help us to understand what is actually happening within the trials, or what actually did happen within the trials, and what is actually helpful, so that maybe we can fine tune the modality now that we've like practiced it for with, I guess, several hundred people over the past 10, 20 years or whatever it is. So I'm kind of interested in more of those discussions. I have also heard, you know, critique about how we are approaching healing from PTSD in general. Like as far as individual healing versus collective healing. And I think that's a really interesting conversation. It seems like some of the critiques are kind of being like levied in a way to suggest that individual healing for systemic oppressive harms is an approach that doesn't make sense. Um, I think it plays a part in the greater picture, because I think these systemic or oppressive messages and harms that affect sexual assault survivors, for example, is something that can start to be untangled in an individual therapy context. But certainly these oppressive, misogynistic, messages that a lot of survivors absorb, is a really big reason why the trauma is so long lasting, or why they have PTSD, or at least part of the reason why. So I hope we can uh, not place too much emphasis on individual healing, but know that that is part of it. Like, there's room for both, I think. So, and people are talking more about like group MDMA assisted therapy. I'm interested in like group integration therapy experiences and things like that. So I think there are ways to like bridge individual experiences into more group or collective experiences. Yeah, and I think we touched on, just kind of more information and more messaging about how MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and I would say probably every other psychedelic assisted therapy for a severe mental health disorder, it's still work. It's still therapy. It's still difficult, at times, and it is not going to work for everybody, unfortunately. I do, we know that in the clinical trials that not everybody had a positive result, not everyone had a good outcome. So I'd like to hear more discussion about like why did that happen for those people? Were there similarities? Like how can we use that data to make sure that people who are signing up for this are appropriate? Or are there things that are being done that are obstructions to healing that can be fixed for certain people, for certain populations, things like that. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for that question, unless you had more questions.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you really sort of wish there was more nuance in understanding what people's experiences were like. Maybe more like qualitative work describing like the process of therapy and all of that, and maybe more media coverage too, like describing how it is like work.
Yeah.
Like that didn't come up enough. I do think that there really wasn't enough focus on the mechanism in general, and I think a lot of that was just out of this desire to get MDMA through the FDA process as quickly as possible. And from a drug development standpoint, maybe it doesn't matter how it works, it just matters that it works. So that I think is something that I wish everybody could, like in the psychedelic field, could just take a step back from wanting everything approved so quickly and just focus more on the fundamental questions of like, what are these drugs actually doing in the brain? How are they contributing to people getting better?
Yeah.
And what can we do to improve outcomes? So,
yeah, I absolutely agree with that. The better we can understand what it's doing that is working, I think the better off we'll all be. Like, I have been, yeah, it's, I could talk more about that, but I think that's a really critical question that hasn't been explored enough. On the other hand, I know that there are a lot of peripheral things that are involved in clinical trials that obviously affect the way the experience goes, like the anxiety that comes with, not knowing if you'll get an active drug or placebo, for example, um, or things needing to move along at a pace that is maybe not the way it would happen in the real world. Those are things that make me eager to see what it would be like out of the clinical trial setting and more in just a clinical setting. But at the same time, we don't want to rush things prematurely. So
Yeah.
I'm both eager for it and want to make sure that it's being done as best as it can.
I'm curious, like, what sort of maybe advice or recommendations you might give to future therapists working with MDMA. Like, what do you think they could do better?
That's a great question. So sorry, I wrote notes about some of your questions just because there's a lot to unpack and I wanted to make sure I was touching on things that had come to mind. I actually think I touched a lot of the things I wanted to say about this I touched on before. So I think I guess when you ask that question, are you talking about future therapists working with MDMA assisted therapy in clinical trial settings, or in
Both?
both? Yeah. Well, I think I guess this answer could go for both clinical trial settings and clinical settings if and when it is approved by the FDA. I think being able to speak to your clients about the cultural and maybe political implications of this treatment is really important. Right now, this is, in where we stand in 2024, this is like a highly politicized and controversial even treatment, using a drug that is otherwise federally illegal. It has a lot of stigma attached to it. So being able to speak to your patient about what their opinions coming into the treatment are about these drugs, like what are their beliefs about drug use, what's attached to their beliefs about it, are they holding on to stigma about drug use, is that going to affect their experience, if they're able to make breakthroughs with this treatment that they weren't able to make after years or even decades of struggling with other treatments, how will they process the successes of the treatment along with the potential grief that might come as a side effect of that? Like, these are really big issues that might be coming up for them and probably will. So I think being able to prepare your client for, such a intense and unfortunately highly politicized treatment, that's going to be part of the experience for them. So I think therapists should be prepared to build constructive, or to include constructive, honest, nuanced conversations about these things with their clients. I think also handling the inherent excitement of this treatment without projecting too much expectancy onto any particular result is something that should be talked about at length with clients going into it, and also making sure that your clients have a support system as they go through this experience and afterwards, like people in their immediate family, their partner. I remember hearing I don't know where I read this at some point, but the therapist like invited or allowed the patient's spouse to like come into the office after the dosing session, but before they left. So like the effects of the MDMA had worn off, but they were able to kind of bring that person's significant other into the space at a appropriate time. And I think things like that could make a really big impact and help, help the patient like integrate the experience with loved ones in their lives. And this is I felt that this was important to me, and I want to say that I think one of the reasons why this treatment was so positively effective for me and has had long lasting positive results, I think it's because I had really great um, therapy afterwards. So after the
Mm.
trial ended and I was completely phased out, I was able to continue with a therapist who actually is also trained in MDMA assisted therapy. And I was able to give her like permission to speak to my trial therapist, all of that informed consent and um, I don't know if that's the right word, but when you sign a release form to allow your therapist to talk to somebody else on your behalf. So there was like continuity of care for me. And I think I am very, very, very lucky that I was able to do that. My insurance covered it, thankfully. So um, I think that having a plan for um, follow up support long after the trial has ended. And hopefully, if you can, provide a referral to somebody who is informed or even trained with this modality is can be crucial for integration and positive results that last long after the trial is over. Um, Yeah, I think those are my main points. If you have any other questions about that, I'd be happy to answer, but those are the main ones that come to mind.
Mm. Makes sense. Um, let's see. Is there anything else relevant that you think is worth mentioning?
I think there's so much more worth mentioning and so much more to talk about. But
Yeah.
like, uh, I think, I guess I think the big thing that the big reason why I'm contributing to conversation and um, what I think we need is more constructive criticism, constructive
Mm.
feedback about what's going on and about MAPS and about the field as a whole. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to name too many names, but we really need constructive feedback. Um, and I hope I can contribute to that. And I'm grateful to be able to connect with people like you and others that I've connected with on X, Twitter. People are moving to Bluesky. It seems a little calmer there. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
we could be a little bit nicer to each other in the space. It got a little heated. Yeah. So I hope we can kind of soften a little bit. Criticism is great, but I think I've experienced some unhelpful input from people. I will leave it at that. But I hope we can move into a more constructive space.
So I guess going forward, what would you hope critiques of MAPS or psychedelic assisted therapy, what do you hope those are more like?
How do I want to word this? I think there's a way that we can, nitpick is a negative word. I think there's a way that we can like carefully comb through treatment manuals, for example, and even yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Like there are things that are part of the atmosphere, the milieu, that language that's being used, language that's in the treatment manual, maybe language that's being used by um, people who work for MAPS, or people who are part of the trial, that I think we can examine a little bit further. Um, there's connections to the MAPS protocol is connected to Stan Grof and holotropic breath work. And there's a lot of aspects of those modalities that maybe aren't the best fit for MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So, like, how can we frame it in a way that includes what's relevant, leaves out what might be too risky or too harmful? Like, how I think we need conversations that are able to work with what we have and make it better instead of tearing it all apart or throwing it all away, demonizing people who have done a great deal of work in bringing us to where we are today. I don't really think that's helpful right now. I think we have made a tremendous amount of progress, and there's a lot of good stuff that is going on. There are a lot of good things about the MAPS protocol that we can start to examine it more carefully without demonizing the whole thing, because some rightfully so bad things, have happened. That's not my favorite way to word that, but I think we can recognize that bad things have happened, that should not be repeated, without throwing away everything else. We've got to be able to, like, really examine what's there and reduce harms, increase the possibilities for healing, reduce harms. And I think maybe, I think there's a possibility that maybe MAPS should let go of some things within their manual that are distracting, perhaps. So I hope that MAPS is listening. I hope that, like, patient feedback can be part of things going forward.
Yeah, it makes sense. Just, I feel like some people would like to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
It almost seems. But, we can have constructive conversations that are focused on improvement of something that seems to work for some people in a pretty extraordinary way. So, yeah. What if there was, like, one aspect of the treatment manual that you think is distracting or maybe problematic that you could fix or tell MAPS about, what would it be?
Okay, so I only recently downloaded it and I haven't read it all because it's really long. I did read, like, there's a lot of paperwork given to patients about what the treatment is like, and which I read through before I started the trial, and there's, like, nothing in it that was, like, even a yellow flag or an orange flag. Like, everything is just, like, so harmless, I guess. Like, looking through them, like, just in my brief look in the manual, the use of if I had it in front of me, or if I had recently read it, I could answer this question better. But I don't really know if I'm convinced that even mentioning Stan Grof or holotropic breathwork is even necessary within the manual, because you're not doing holotropic breathwork while a person is on MDMA. But the manual is written, I believe, to also address people who are taking placebo, but it does become a little bit confusing. I think the manual can be simplified. There's also language in there that I think perhaps there could be better words used, like the word surrender, and to, I think it was, I follow Kayla Greenstein and Lachey Devenot. And I believe they were sort of like picking apart some of the language around like advising a client to surrender to the effects of MDMA. Like the word surrender could be triggering to sexual assault survivors, for example. So I think some of these words, like maybe we can explore, like, are there other ways that we can express what we're wanting to express without using a word that could potentially be triggering?
Hmm.
Things like that. Um, in some ways, like I think not fighting the experience, like, if you learn how to trip well, it's all about like going with the flow and all that stuff. And I think there's like truth to that, being open to what comes up, but maybe there's a better word to use than surrender. So, I'm sure there are more little examples like that we can shine a more critical light on without
Hmm.
I don't know, without adopting the
Throwing,
belief.
yeah,
Yeah.
throwing the whole book out.
Throwing the whole
Yeah,
book out. Yeah, I'm trying to like choose my words very carefully.
yeah, I do think Stanislav Grof, oh man, I've read some of his early work and it is just, I honestly started laughing because it was like,
It's
oh,
it's wild.
we're gonna look at the like perinatal matrices and
Yeah.
everybody has birth trauma and oh man, but
Yeah, it's wild. I tried listening to it and I just couldn't get through it either. I'm like, maybe if I tripped and had an experience like this, I'd be like, yeah, he's really onto it. But I never have. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with that being said, though, I think the reason I would guess that people incorporated some of his ideas is just, when they were initially developing this manual, when psychedelic assisted therapies of all types were first being utilized, that was after such a long prohibition. And they just went
yeah.
back to whoever was a leader, in the late 60s. And that's how we ended up with a bunch of antiquated ideas, but I don't I understand how that happened and
Yeah.
I don't think it's bad. I just think it's time, psychedelic science has been a thing really for like 10 years or more, maybe 15 years. So we have enough data now to understand how to work with these substances better and we should
Yeah.
update the manuals accordingly.
I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head that it is a Stan Grof and his holotropic breathwork process is an important part of the history, and it was part of how MAPS developed their MDMA assisted psychotherapy treatment, but it's been more developed now. We don't necessarily need to keep it such a strong part of the like contemporary education, or process around it. I also like we need to remember that Stan Grof is what, like 80 something years old, and he's from the Czech Republic, right? So he's from a completely different generation and a different culture with different historical context. So that probably contributes to why his ideas seem so out there and like antiquated at times. It's of a completely different context. But yes, I think we can stand to like update things. I also wanted to say I'm in school right now, and I'm learning about a lot of the development of a lot of our popular psychological psychotherapy theories, and there's a lot of outdated parts of the history that isn't carried on into contemporary practice. And we didn't throw it all out. We sort of like got rid of the parts that didn't make sense anymore, or that were part of like an understanding, an understanding of people, or of disorders that we now understand is not correct. So things have been updated, and I don't think there's any reason why this form of psychotherapy should be treated any differently. We don't need to throw the whole thing out. We can update it and improve it, just as we've done with virtually every other form of psychotherapy that we use today.
Great, great. So I'm trying to think of like the key sort of takeaways. I suppose, understanding that MDMA assisted psychotherapy, it can be a very difficult process at times. That doesn't mean it won't work. People can have grief and other difficult emotions to be processed, and it's important that the therapist prepares a person to work with that and to also kind of, be willing to engage in a dialogue about the hype and sort of the social cultural landscape that is emerging around these substances. That seems to be important. People being constructive in their critiques, offering ways to improve instead of just dissing things, seems to be quite important. And then it sounded like you really wanted to understand more of how MDMA assisted psychotherapy worked, both from like the perspective of the patient, what is maybe going on phenomenologically, subjectively, that is leading to people to heal or to not heal. And then maybe that includes some underlying neural mechanisms. Who knows? I'm kind of projecting that a little bit, but just wanting to understand what's going on more. So that sounds, like we covered a lot of ground.
That's a really good summary of all the things. Really good summary of all the things. I don't know if I have anything to add. Maybe we should leave it there.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to follow along with the input and critiques and the work that you're doing. You have more of a science background and neuroscience background, correct? Yeah. I do not. My background is in art and psychology. So I'm really excited for the collaborations with different fields and to bring people with different backgrounds together to bring new perspectives to it. I feel like the landscape is changing all the time. There's like new stuff that comes out like every day. My feelings change. I guess one other thing that is, no, I don't want to bring something up at the end, but.
No, go for it.
Well, I guess I just want to say I've had a lot of grief around the FDA rejection of this, primarily because I was really hopeful that this could be available to more people quickly. I do think things need to be worked out first. I think the criticism that sort of contributed to the rejection kind of added insult to injury for me. And I doubt I'm alone in being a patient participant who has felt grief around it, and other therapists who were involved who did really, really good work and, are sort of being maybe misrepresented or fear they're being misrepresented because of pretty extreme critiques that have been floating around. So I guess I would just encourage people to speak out about what their experience was like, if they want to, and what they think the field needs, and just make sure that we have more critics who are voicing their opinions, and that it's not just a handful of people saying, kind of getting all the limelight. So appreciate you having this platform and hope to continue conversation with you. Again, I'm excited about your work and I want to learn more about it. So my life is really grad student life is crazy. I barely have time to keep up with what I'm doing, but I hope to dive in more and learn more from you. Anything else that you want to add?
No, All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Alrighty.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.